Well, hello there, I'm Paul and welcome to another English language A-level video. Now this one is going to be about language change and language diversity. So it's basically how to write an English language A-level diversity or change essay. So I'm assuming that you are an A-level English language student and maybe you do the AQA, in which case this is relevant for your paper 2 section A. Now, what does the question actually look like? Well, it's a 45-minute either-or task without data. So unlike other aspects of the exams on AQA, there's no data. You're totally naked. So meanings and representations, for example, you've got your data in front of you. CLD, you're given some data. But on this one, you have to go armed into the exam with a whole heap of AO2 knowledge. Otherwise, you're going to come a cropper. Now, this is the 2019 exam, so either evaluate the idea that language variation has decreased over time, or evaluate the idea that changes in communication technologies have had a damaging effect on the English language. And you'll notice that the mark is out of 30, that mark is then doubled to 60, and the total number of marks that you get on the AQA is 500. So this, even though you're only spending 45 minutes on it, it's got quite a high premium, and it's worth more than the whole of your language investigation that you sweated blood over, and also the whole of your original writing. Okay. Now, let's have a think about the approaching the task. Obviously, one of the tasks is going to be more likely to be focused on language diversity, and the other one is going to be focused on language change. It's useful to bandy around these terms, synchronic variation and diachronic variation. So synchronic variation, that noun phrase simply means language diversity. So synchronic means at one time, as in to synchronize your watches. Not that you lot will have watches. Whereas diachronic variation means variation between 2 points of time. So it's about language change. Okay, so that's what these essays are all about, synchronic variation and diachronic variation. But don't think of the two of those things as being mutually exclusive concepts. No, no, no. They are interlinked. So don't just think, and I'm looking here at my AQA textbook here, don't just think, right, well, one of the questions is only going to be about stuff in the language diversity chapter, and the other one is only going to be relevant for the stuff in the language change chapter, because as you can see in this video, they are very much interconnected. So don't think of them as being separate boxes. Think, for example, about the concept of dialect levelling, which means the decrease in differences in language over time. Now, that as a concept relates to both language diversity and to language change. Okay, so what we're saying to you is think holistically, think outside the box, and don't think of change and diversity as being mutually exclusive. Okay, so how do you prepare an answer? Well, first of all, clearly, don't prevaricate. Choose one of the two and go for it and stick with it. What you need to do initially is to deconstruct the keywords of the task, and you need to be noting down the relevant AO2 concepts, theories, and case studies. So let's just take, for example, the first question. Evaluate the idea that language variation has decreased over time. Now, first of all, this command word, evaluate. So that's the top level marker descriptor, evaluate. If you're lower down, like in level 2 or 3, you're just explaining and illustrating. If you're further up in level 4, then you're going to be analysing. Whereas here, you're in the top dogs because you're going to be evaluating. And evaluating means weighing up competing arguments. So you're looking at the relative validity of the strengths and weaknesses of certain arguments, and you are coming to a considered conclusion. That is being evaluative, and it's rock hard to do. So you need lots of practice on it. Language variation. Notice what we're doing here. We're deconstructing the keywords of the task. What does language variation mean? Well, when we looked at the examiner's report on this, quite a lot of students across the country, when they answered this, didn't really know what language variation meant. So language variation means diversity, and it means diversity in terms of our beloved language levels. Yes, we're talking about lexis and grammar and phonology and graphology and discourses. Okay, so you're never very far away from talking about the different language levels when you're doing a successful A-level piece. Okay, so don't just write in your essay about words, don't just do lexis, but make sure that you cover these other language levels too. So variation means diversity in terms of those levels, and we have variety in terms of individuals. You speak differently to your best mate. We have variety in social groups, like for example, I as a male may be speaking in a different way for different purposes to a female. We have variety across the UK in different districts and areas. And of course, we have huge variety across the English-speaking world. So you're breaking down there, you're deconstructing what is actually meant by variation. And we've got this contention that language variation has decreased over time. So the claim is being made here that English is less varied and it's more standardized than it was in the past. So, evidence that language variation has decreased over time. So you need to be sort of writing in the margin of the exam paper, well, what can I think of that I've studied in the booklets or in my textbook that's going to be relevant to this? What evidence can I think of that language variation has decreased over time and it's become more standardized? Well, you might want to draw upon Haugen's 4 stages of standardization. That to me would be a logical place to start, and is explained in the textbook on page 217 in this AQA textbook. Because Haugen's stages of standardization go through this process. You've got selection, codification, elaboration, and implementation. And if you look at those stages, they are sort of moving towards a more standardized form of language. First of all, you've got selection. We have Caxton, who is a printer, who's scratching his head and wondering, well, what form of English am I possibly going to print my English in the late 15th century? Is it going to be Northumbrian English, or Wessex English, or Mercian English? Because all of these Englishes are very, very different. So there is a huge dialectical variation between the different forms of English. And what he goes for, in the end, is called East Midlands dialect. So East Midlands dialect is sort of chancery standard English that's used in the capital, in Oxford and Cambridge, and in that rich agricultural belt that's north of London. Okay, so surely you'd be arguing that we have an improvement that's being made there because we're moving away from the sort of linguistic anarchy that is demonstrated in Caxton's anecdote. I don't know whether you've looked at this, but there's a very famous piece of writing done by Caxton where he talks about 2 northern merchants who come down south and try to buy some eggs from a lady whose word for eggs is eiren, and neither of them can understand each other. So it's a great demonstration of how in this time period, we're talking about the late Middle English period, there was mutual incomprehension, that people in different districts, different regions of the country were finding it very tough to understand each other. So surely we've moved away from that. That's the selection period. And then you've got, according to Haugen's model, codification. So this is in the 18th and 19th century when the grammarians and lexicographers get their greedy hands on the language, and they basically lay down the prescriptive rules of what a good gentleman or lady should be doing with their language in order to be thought to be educated. So there are many of these. The example that's given in the textbook is Bishop Lowth, who in 1762 produces a short introduction to English grammar and lays down various shibboleths, various rules which should not be broken. Things like never do a double negative. Okay, so you could say that if this codification period is going on, that surely is decreasing language variation, at least in terms of people's written English. But at the same time, you've also got what Haugen calls elaboration as well. So this is the idea that things are happening to the language which are increasing the resources, the richness and the expressiveness of the language. And you think, for example, about the Renaissance period when we have lots of borrowing happening, where English-speaking people for the first time are hearing words from different cultures, was like cargo from Spanish, and they're starting to use that kind of word. So the elaboration process is a sort of counter-argument to the idea that language variation is decreasing over time. And then finally, you've got this notion of implementation, that basically authority figures try to stop language from changing, and they lay down what they call a standard form of language. So you've got institutions like the national curriculum, and in order for you to pass your SAT test as a Year 6 primary school student, you have to spell things in certain ways, you have to construct sentences in certain ways, you have to write with a certain level of formality. Okay, so all of that stuff would be evidence that language variation has decreased over time. You could also think, and this is mentioned in the AQA textbook on page 204, about the very mixed, disparate nature of Old and Middle English before the emergence of Standard English. Use the words Old English very carefully. We're talking about English spoken between 449 AD and 1100, and Middle English is that medieval period between 1100 and round about 1500. But again, it's this idea that there was a heck of a lot of dialectical diversity in the pronunciation of words, and therefore in the spelling of words as well, because of course there was no standard form of spelling in Old or Middle English. Take the word Knight. So there we've got three variant spellings of it. And so what you find is that different writers are spelling things in different ways. And indeed, single writers, and William Caxton does this, single writers spell things in different ways in one single page of a text. Okay, so we've got evidence that language variation has decreased over time. What other evidence could we come up with? So we've got this idea of dialect levelling, which I mentioned before, and the sort of posh definition of this, and this is taken direct from the textbook, the process by which language forms of different parts of the country converge and become more similar over time with the loss of regional features and reduced diversity of language. So it's the idea that people living in sort of remote rural areas, we no longer have those very sort of distinctive forms that we might have heard in, let's say, North Yorkshire villages 100 years ago. And so there are lots of reasons for this. There's a good definition there from Leslie Milroy, the linguist, who says that large-scale disruption of close-knit localized networks that have historically maintained highly systematic and complex sets of socially structured linguistic norms. So people are no longer, being born, growing up, working and dying in very small communities. People are moving around. Okay, we have also the reduction of rural employment, so there are fewer people that are working in the countryside, and therefore there's fewer uses of language that are distinctive to that part of the countryside. We have, of course, the increase in social mobility, so we no longer have people necessarily stuck in the working classes for the whole of their lives. And of course, we have increased interaction with people of other speech varieties, including exposure to other speech varieties in the media, such as on the internet. So all of that, you could argue, is evidence that language variation has decreased over time. However, and there are always sort of counter-arguments to counter against it, there are sort of survivors of dialect levelling, because you could well argue that actually most people, for quite a lot of their lives, speak in a non-standard way. And here are some examples of the things that they do. They do things like multiple negation. Never do multiple negation. You've got things like using them as a demonstrative adjective, as in, pass them books, will you? And you've also got things like the absence of plural marking, like it's 12 miles to Richmond. Okay, so there are these survivors of dialect levelling, and Folks and Doherty, a couple of researchers in the back end of the 1990s, noticed how TH fronting, the tendency of people to say 1, 2, 3 rather than 1, 2, 3, had actually spread from a very localized area in the southeast right across the country. So, you could give that as evidence, I suppose, that yes, language variation is decreasing because more and more people are pronouncing it in a kind of non-RP way. Okay, so what other evidence can we think of? Well, if you're getting stuck in the exam, always run to your language levels. Try and think, right, what have I said about phonology and grammar and graphology and all the rest of them? So, for example, on phonology, we have the development of estuary English, which is a kind of halfway house between RP and Cockney. So we've got this development of estuary English across the whole of southern England, and that process sort of starts in the 1980s and goes through into the 1990s. So you get uses of things like the glottal stop in sentences, which you can illustrate in that sentence there with a bottle of water in Gatwick Airport, where I've sort of taken out the t sounds and I've substituted them for glottal stops, as in get instead of get. Okay, so you could say that's evidence of language variation decreasing over time. If you think about graphology, which is the visual elements of language, think about lettering. Up to the early 19th century, there was considerable variation in how you wrote particular letters or how publishers printed individual letters. And you had, of course, the S, with different publishers doing different things with S's, using the long S and the short S. So lots of variation, and of course lots of variation in grammar as well. So take a particular grammatical item like the second person pronoun, for example. Up to the 18th century, there was considerable variation in usage of the second person pronoun. You had thou, thee, and thy for the addressing individuals, for single people, and for showing a low level of formality. On the other hand, you've got ye, you, and your, which is the plural form and is a higher level of formality. Okay, and if you read of works like Shakespeare, he's in that period where he's alternating between using different forms in different sorts of ways. Okay, so the fact that we now are left with the paltry you and your is surely evidence that language variation has decreased over time. You could also add to that the disappearance of some very distinctive sociolects. I'm thinking about things like Cockney rhyming slang and Polari, the homosexual language used by gay males, principally in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. So born out of a particular social context. And then when that social context changed, i.e. when homosexuality became legalised in 1967, then that virtually led to the disappearance of Polari as this kind of coded language. Okay, so the fact that Cockney rhyming slang doesn't really exist, or it only really exists in a very watered down form, and Polari, words like fantabuloso, don't really exist at all. Surely that is more evidence that language variation has decreased over time. Now, hopefully, by this point in the video, you are convinced that, language change and language diversity are false opposites. Really, it's all part of one thing. You then need to be thinking about counter evidence, so evidence that language variation has not decreased over time. Think about World English varieties. I mean, that's probably a great place to start. And this is where you can draw upon your knowledge about the circles, like the models of World English. And the forerunner of that was Catchrew's model from the early 1990s, where he thought of World Englishes as three circles. And if you think about the middle one, what he's calling the outer circle, he called that norm developing. So that's the idea that across the world, there are these forms of English that are developing their own standards. So you could find a couple of examples. Again, most of the examples I've done here just come straight from the textbook. In Nigerian English, you've got the word bushmeat, which means game. So meat that is being hunted to be eaten, bushmeat. From grammar, you've got things like she is knowing her science from Indian English. So the use of that progressive aspect of the verb. Here being used on a mental verb in a way that perhaps you wouldn't do in British Standard English. Okay, so the emergence of world English varieties is surely evidence that language variation has not decreased and in fact is increasing in variety over time. Similarly, you could go to the internet and you could look at online communication and you could say, well, look, because people are putting stuff on the internet, like, for example, this video on YouTube, I'm not being monitored by anybody and nobody is editing what I'm doing. So there aren't any gatekeepers that are telling me how I should be using my language. And therefore, we've got a heck of a lot of variation that's happening. So if you're in the gaming community, you're probably using abbreviations like AFK and GTG, like we've got to go, in your communication. So we've got all of these sub-genres that are happening, which are making language variation actually increase. We've also got the emergence of new accents and dialects. So you've got things like good old multicultural English, which has obviously been impacted on very much by migrations, and is very much an aspect of what's happening in London. But think of examples of MLE. You've got man, for example, being used as a pronoun. You've got this is me being used as a quotative. The key to this is always try and think of single examples and make sure that your examples come from different language levels that are going to evidence the point that you're making. You've also got the emergence of other new English forms. It's not just MLE, but you've got other diverse urban communities. And from the textbook, you've got the work that's done by Gary Ives, where he's looked at teenage Asian heritage English and seen that it's actually influenced by such a wide range of different factors. It's not just the Mirpuri heritage of those Asian heritage teenagers that's influencing the language. A couple of examples that are given in the textbook, heavy, much, and shotter. Again, these sorts of things go out of fashion very quickly, so those words there, they're probably not used by these people anymore. What other evidence have we got that language variation has not decreased over time? Well, surely you've got this idea that Joanna Thornborough talks about on page 146 in the textbook, that people continue to perform identities through language. That basically, people are choosing to use language in order to foreground aspects of their identity. Okay, so they have agency, they have choices in how they use language, and sociolinguistic variables continue to influence their language choices. I put three of them down there. So how old you are is going to have a big impact still on your language. And there you can draw upon Stenstrom and Eckert, who on page 168 in the textbook talk about how teenage talk differs from adult features. You've got the material about gender, where you've got people like Deborah Cameron with her diversity model and Judith Butler here talking about gender performativity, i.e. it's a mistake to assert, or even to assert, as it says there, that women are a group with common language characteristics. Okay, and then you've got occupation as another sociolinguistic variable where, jobs are spawning all sorts of new forms of language. And the example that's given in the textbook is jargon that's used in a particular supermarket where communication is achieved apparently through Team 5, SQT, Protector Line, and steering wheels, whatever that means. So complete gobbledygook to the rest of the world, but obviously means something very specialised in these occupational groups. So that's further evidence that language variation has not decreased over time. I suppose at this point we have to go to our friend Mark. I'm talking about Mark Scheme. I said to you before the thing is marked out at 30. There is AO1, which gets a mark out of 10. Now have a look at this. AO1 is about you using your language terms, and it's you using coherent written expression. If you're down here in level 2, it means that you're like a sort of average GCSE student who doesn't really know very many linguistic terms on an A-level course. So you're using terms inappropriately or inconsistently. And what's more, you're not really organising your language into very clear paragraphs. Whereas here, level 3, which is more like a kind of C grade, it's clear. So you've got clear topics and clear paragraphs. It's not necessarily going to be very sophisticated, but it's clear. And we do have linguistic terms that are being used. So you might be saying, for example, the word pronoun or second person pronoun, and you might be doing it in a consistent and appropriate way. When you get into your level 4s here, we're talking about precision and detail. So this is where you're starting to use terms like epistemic modal auxiliary verb, for example, or progressive aspect mental verb. So it's that precision and detail that your level 3s aren't doing. That's what you're doing at level 4. And you're more attuned to the actual argument. You're beginning to develop a proper line of argument where you're sort of laying out the arguments for and against. Whereas your level 5, up at the top here, well, obviously you're using key terms and linguistic methods, and what you're showing is patterns that are going across language. So, for example, before I talked about Cockney rhyming slang and Polari being similar in the sense that they're both codes which exclude some people from understanding. Now, that's a pattern that you've identified between two quite disparate things. So patterns are in your level 5, and also complexities as well. So it's the idea that the answer to this question is by no means black and white, and your best linguists in the world aren't necessarily going to agree on one conclusion. So there are complexities in all of the arguments that you're putting forward. And the other thing is that you are guiding the reader. So you're taking the reader by the hand and you're guiding them through with really nice topic sentences. So there's your AO1. Your AO2 is a bit more sort of bland in the way that it's described. But even at level 3 here, you are supposed to be showing detailed knowledge of linguistic ideas. Up into the level 4, which is round about a B grade, you're showing that there are different views and approaches of linguistic issues. Okay, so you're showing that there are different perspectives on the same material that you looked at. And on level 5, it's supposed to be this completely conceptualized, synthesized piece. And I think probably the most important word there is challenging. So what your job is to do is to take some of the linguistic stuff that you've learned in the textbook. Let's go back, say, to Catchrue's model, which I mentioned before. If you're a level 5 answer, then you are challenging some of Catchrue's model. And you're saying, well, actually, this model is pre-internet, and therefore it doesn't take into account the way that people across the world are using language, remotely through the internet. So there's an example of me challenging a viewpoint that I found in the textbook. Okay, so there's your mark scheme. Now let me give you just 4 or 5 ideas on how to knock together a really good essay. There's the essay question again. Evaluate the idea that language variation has decreased over time. Now, first of all, you've got to be addressing the question directly. Too many students start up with kind of warm-up paragraphs where they say very little. Your first paragraph has to identify the key ideas of the question. English usage varies between individuals, social groups and places, both in the UK and across the world. We're getting straight into the question here about language variation, aren't we? I'm defining what I'm meaning by language variation. This synchronic variation, which is that noun phrase which they use at the beginning of the video, is characteristic in all language levels, from word choices and meanings, lexis and semantics, to grammatical forms, syntax and morphology, from phonology, pronunciation patterns, to graphology, the visual aspects of language. Now that's lovely because I'm showing to the examiner that I understand that language isn't just about words, but it's all about these language levels, which are so important, aren't they? Because they are there in the first chapters of all of the textbooks. You've got to know, your language levels. Some claim that English is becoming less diverse and more standardized over the years. Okay, whilst others argue that language is much more varied now than when spoken by an estimated 2 million people at the start of the Middle English period. So in that last sentence, what you're doing is you're showing that there are different perspectives on this. Okay, you're not necessarily explaining which side of the fence you're at this point. You're just laying out that actually there are different viewpoints. What I've done is I've addressed the question directly and I've identified the key areas of the question. That's what you need to do. Here's my second bit of advice. Base your paragraphs around clear topic sentences which address the question and guide the reader. If you do great topic sentences, you're going to do a great essay. There's no doubt about it. You're guiding the reader. Here's what I mean. Haugen's four-part model of standardization would suggest over many centuries English has decreased in variation. Right, this is a great topic sentence because it's naming a particular researcher and it's telling you, the reader, what the whole of that paragraph is going to be about and linking it in to this notion of variation decreasing over time. Here's another example. The process of dialect levelling in the UK is further evidence of a decrease in language variation over time. The disappearance of distinctive sociolects such as Polari and Cockney Rhyming slang could also be regarded as standardisation of language over time. So you've got three topic sentences there which are basically saying in this paragraph I'm largely going to be agreeing with the premise of the question. On the other hand, many might claim that the emergence of different world Englishes has widened the diversity in the language. So this is clearly going to be put forward a counter-argument. Many would argue that developments in communication have encouraged, and I can't say that's hidden behind my screen, but I'm assuming that it means encourage variation and diversity. So you've got 5 different examples of good, clear topic sentences which are guiding the reader. Here's my third piece of advice. Combine AO1 terms with AO2 concepts throughout. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're being asked. AO1 and AO2. AO1, remember, means how cohesive is your written expression and what key terms are you using. AO2 is about the concepts and the theories. On the other hand, many might claim that the emergence of different world Englishes has widened the diversity in the language. The plural inflection affixed to English acknowledges the distinctive nature of each variety identified in Catchre's model as norm-developing outer circle forms with significant variations from British Standard English. Now, examples from these world Englishes could include the concrete compound noun bushmeat in Nigerian English, the progressive aspects on mental verbs, such as she is knowing her science in Indian English, and the Singlish particle la. These World English examples represent Schneider's endonormative stabilization stage, in which speakers accept localized varieties as standard forms. We have got a perfect marriage here between AO1 and AO2, have we not? Look at the bits in blue. These are things that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to do as a GCSE student. Plural inflection affixed, concrete compound noun, progressive aspect on mental verb, particle, AO1 terms. And they have been combined with those AO2 concepts, which you certainly wouldn't have used at GCSE level. So Catchre's model as a norm developing outer circle and Schneider's endonormative stabilization stage. If you're puzzled about what those mean, like the Schneider one, again, it's in the textbook. Look under the section on the World Englishes. Right, what's my next piece of advice? I don't have any other piece of advice, apparently. Let me see if I can go through here. Here we go. So this is my last piece of advice. Complete your essay evaluatively, reaching a clear conclusion. Students always ask, do I need a conclusion on this? And the answer is yes, even though you're only writing for 45 minutes, because you need to have weighed up the pros and cons of various competing arguments and come to a balanced conclusion. This is what I mean by an evaluative ending. So in conclusion, English can be said to be continuing to diversify over time. reflecting the increasingly diverse nature of its speakers in the UK and across the world. Since, as Joanna Thornborough argued, language is one of the most fundamental ways of establishing our identity, every English speaker, and there are estimated to be somewhere near 2 billion of them globally, shapes their language to reflect their experience, determined by various sociolinguistic factors such as gender, occupation, age, and social class. So, despite forces of standardization, English variation will probably continue to increase in diversity into the future. Now that is a proper conclusion, isn't it? It's basically coming to a conclusion that is challenging the essay question. Okay, so I hope that's been useful to you. I've given you 5 bits of advice upon that. Good luck with your language change and language variation future pieces. I hope it all goes well.